Welcome to History Teller YT, where the past comes alive through stories that pull you in from the first moment. Today we step into one of the most dramatic turning points in world history. This is the final rise and fall of Napoleon Bonaparte, a battle that reshaped nations, ended an era, and decided the fate of Europe in a single day. The Battle of Waterloo is far more than a clash of armies. It is a story of ambition pushed to its breaking point, of commanders struggling against time, weather, and each other, and of soldiers fighting with everything they had on muddy fields that soon became symbols of courage and tragedy. From the desperate defense of Hougoumont to the thunder of Ney's massive cavalry charges, from the brutal struggle for Haye, Sainte to the arrival of the Prussians that sealed Napoleon's fate, every moment carries the weight of history. By the time the Imperial Guard makes its final stand, the world is already changing in ways no one on that battlefield could fully see. If you want to feel the tension, the choices, the turning points, and the human cost behind this legendary confrontation, then stay with us. The story you're about to hear is one of power, downfall, and transformation. Let's begin. In early 1815, Europe was still trying to steady itself after 2 decades of upheaval. The French Revolution had torn apart the old political order, and Napoleon Bonaparte had built an empire that stretched across much of the continent. After a string of disastrous campaigns, his power collapsed, and he was exiled to the island of Elba. Most European leaders believed the nightmare of constant warfare was finally over. Monarchies were restored, old borders were being redrawn, and diplomats at the Congress of Vienna were working to rebuild a stable balance of power. Yet beneath the surface there was unease. Many feared that France might rise again or that old rivalries could flare up. When reports reached Europe that Napoleon had escaped Elba and landed in France with a small force, shock spread through royal courts and military headquarters. What surprised them even more was how quickly he regained control. As he marched north, soldiers who had once sworn loyalty to the restored French king abandoned their posts and joined him. Crowds cheered, and within weeks he was back in Paris. His return, often called the 100 Days, forced Europe to confront the possibility of renewed conflict. Rather than negotiate, the major Allied powers chose to defeat him once and for all. The coalition formed against Napoleon moved with urgency. Britain, Prussia, Austria, and Russia agreed that their armies would advance toward France and end his rule permanently. Among the most important commanders was the Duke of Wellington, who had defeated French forces in Spain and Portugal during the Peninsular War. Known for his steady leadership and firm discipline, he was respected even by his enemies. Wellington assembled a mixed army of British regulars, Dutch and Belgian troops, and soldiers from several German states. They were capable but uneven in training and experience. Meanwhile, the Prussian army under Marshal Gebhard Leberecht von Blücher was gathering to join him. Blücher was aggressive and fearless, still burning with the desire to strike back after earlier defeats in Napoleon's hands. Napoleon, aware that he was outnumbered, understood he had to act quickly. He built a force that blended hardened veterans with new recruits. Many soldiers were eager to fight again for the man they viewed as France's rightful leader. His strategy was straightforward. He would move north into Belgium, defeat Wellington and Blücher separately before the larger coalition armies arrived, and then negotiate from a position of strength. Time was against him, but he believed his speed and experience could compensate. By mid-June, Napoleon launched his campaign. His army advanced rapidly, moving between the British and Prussian armies to drive a wedge that would prevent them from uniting. This maneuver had been one of his signature tactics in earlier victories. The first major clash took place at Ligny on June 16th, where Napoleon managed to defeat the Prussians but failed to destroy them. Blücher was injured but survived, and his army withdrew in relatively good order. At almost the same time, a smaller part of the French army fought Wellington's forces at Quatre-Bras. The battle was hard-fought and confused, and though the French pushed fiercely, Wellington managed to hold the crossroads. He eventually realized that he could not remain there without risking his army being cut off. He withdrew northward to a ridge near a village called Waterloo. The position looked defensible, and he believed he could hold it long enough for the Prussians to regroup. Napoleon assumed the Prussians were in full retreat and would not return soon. Confident that he could defeat Wellington before Blücher recovered, he marched his army toward Waterloo. As French columns approached the ridge on June 17th, heavy rain fell across the countryside. The downpour soaked gunpowder, turned fields into mud, and slowed movement. Both armies prepared for the decisive battle that would determine the future of Europe. Wellington chose his ground with care. The ridge south of the village of Waterloo gave him a natural defensive advantage. The crest of the ridge allowed his troops to remain hidden from French artillery until the moment they needed to stand and fire. The farms and manors in the area served as fortified outposts. The most important of these were Hougoumont on the right, Sainte in the center, and Peyplate on the left. Each compound had stone walls, gates, courtyards, and farmland that could be turned into strong points. Wellington positioned his men so that even if one section came under intense pressure, they could fall back behind the ridge or receive reinforcement from nearby units. His strategy was not to attack early, but to endure the French assault until the Prussian army appeared on the field. Wellington understood Napoleon's habit of striking fast and hard. He intended to absorb the blow, hold firm, and then crush the French when Blücher arrived. Though his army was mixed in quality, he trusted his veterans and the strong defensive nature of the landscape. Napoleon surveyed Wellington's position on the morning of June 18th and recognized that a direct assault would be difficult. Still, he believed the British-led army was fragile and that he could shatter it with careful coordination. His plan focused on attacking Wellington's right to draw troops away from the center. Once the British moved to reinforce that flank, he would hit the weakened center with a massive push. He also assigned Marshal Ney to lead part of the attack, counting on Ney's courage and reputation for boldness. The heavy rain from the previous night forced Napoleon to delay the start of the battle. The sodden ground made it difficult to move artillery, and firing cannons on wet soil reduced their effectiveness. Napoleon hoped waiting a few hours would allow the ground to dry enough for his guns to play their usual devastating role. His confidence remained high. He believed Blücher was too far away to intervene, and he trusted his army's ability to break Wellington's line. Even so, some officers felt uneasy. They had faced Wellington in the past and knew he would not be easily defeated. The field of Waterloo was not an empty plain. It was a patchwork of hedges, sunken lanes, farm buildings, and rolling slopes. These features shaped how both sides fought. Hougoumont, a large walled farm on the western side of the field, would soon become a focal point of brutal fighting. Sainte, a farmhouse on a rise in the center, provided shelter for riflemen who could slow advancing French troops. On the eastern side, Peyplate and nearby hamlets guarded the route where Prussian forces might appear. Wellington understood that holding these strong points would delay French advances and force Napoleon to commit more troops than he wanted. The landscape also limited cavalry charges because narrow lanes and muddy ground could break the momentum of horsemen. Artillery placement was equally important. The ridge offered Wellington ideal positions for hidden batteries that could fire from behind cover. Napoleon needed clear fields of fire for his own guns, though the wet soil frustrated their early performance. Both armies knew that once the battle began, control of these key locations would be vital. The stage was set, and both sides waited for the moment when the first shot would break the morning tension. When Napoleon finally ordered the attack to begin late in the morning, he intended the fighting at Hougoumont to serve as a diversion. His goal was to force Wellington to shift troops away from the center, not to capture the farm at all costs. Yet the battle for Hougoumont quickly grew far beyond the original plan. French infantry advanced across open ground toward the walls while British and Allied troops fired from behind cover. The orchard and woodlands around the farm became scenes of fierce close combat. Units lost cohesion in the thick smoke as officers urged their men forward. The French managed to reach the gates at one point, nearly forcing them open, but defenders slammed them shut just in time. What began as a limited attack soon pulled in more soldiers as French commanders committed reinforcements in hopes of finally taking the position. Wellington sent additional troops to hold it, knowing that if Hougoumont fell early, the French could sweep around his right flank. The fighting there became a battle within the larger battle, drawing thousands of soldiers into a struggle for a single farmhouse. It became clear that Hougoumont would not fall easily, and the French effort there consumed time and manpower Napoleon had not intended to spend. While Hougoumont raged, Napoleon ordered his artillery to begin a massive bombardment of the British line. The ridge where Wellington had positioned his troops protected many from direct fire, but the noise, smoke, and shock waves were felt across the field. Cannonballs bounced along the ground, tearing gaps in formations and smashing into the earth behind the crest. Shells exploded above the ridge, showering fragments onto the men taking cover. For soldiers who had never experienced a full artillery barrage, the noise alone was overwhelming. The British troops waited in disciplined silence, instructed to stay low until needed. Some units shifted slightly to avoid the worst of the fire, but Wellington kept his line steady. Napoleon hoped the barrage would soften the defenses before the main infantry attack. The wet ground still limited the cannons' effectiveness, though they inflicted steady casualties. The thunder of guns echoed across the countryside, signaling that the decisive phase of the campaign had begun. Anyone within earshot understood that the calm morning was over and that the fate of nations was being written in smoke and fire. After the cannon fire, French infantry columns began to move forward toward Wellington Center. Their target was Sainte, the farmhouse held by German troops armed with accurate rifles. The French marched in tight formations, drums beating and officers shouting commands. As they approached, the defenders opened fire from windows, doorways, and sheltered positions. The rifles they carried had longer range and greater accuracy than the muskets used by most soldiers on the field. The French pressed on and reached the outer walls, but struggled to break inside. Reinforcements joined the attack, and the pressure increased. Wellington watched this advance carefully because control of Sainte would give the French a foothold dangerously close to the heart of his army. He began shifting units to prepare for further assaults. Meanwhile, the fighting between French and Prussian forces near Ligny 2 days earlier had already set the stage for what might happen next. If Blücher kept his promise to support Wellington, the French attack on the center could eventually be met by a new and unexpected threat on Napoleon's flank. As midday approached, the battle intensified on all sides, and neither commander could yet predict how the day would end. As midday turned into early afternoon, Marshal was convinced that Wellington's center was weakening. The British-led line had endured hours of bombardment, and the infantry struggle around Sainte appeared to be reaching a turning point. Ney believed that a strong push could break the ridge and split Wellington's army into two isolated pieces. His instincts always leaned toward bold action, sometimes to the point of risk, and he felt certain that this was the moment to decide the battle. He ordered more battalions to push forward, hoping their combined weight would overwhelm the defenders who had remained largely hidden behind a crest. As the French infantry climbed the slope, they met disciplined volleys from British soldiers who waited until the last possible moment to rise and fire. The range was close, and the volleys were devastating. French formations wavered under the impact, yet they continued pressing upward, driven by shouts from officers who reminded them of what victory meant not only to France, but to Napoleon himself. Smoke thickened around the ridge, making it difficult for both sides to see. Drum beats mixed with the steady crack of musket fire, and the hillside became a place of chaos where units lost track of one another. Ney believed success was within reach, but the defenders, supported by fresh reserves, held their ground. What he saw as a weakening line was in fact a flexible defense designed by Wellington to absorb pressure and respond at critical moments. The French attack, though brave, did not achieve a breakthrough and only increased the confusion that already hung over the center of the battlefield. While Ney pressed the center, the brutal struggle at Hougoumont continued without pause. The French commitment to taking the farm had grown far beyond anything Napoleon originally intended. Unit after unit had been drawn into the fighting as commanders convinced themselves that one more push would finally drive out the stubborn defenders. Inside the compound, British Guards, Hanoverians, and other Allied troops fought from room to room, garden to orchard, often with no clear view of the wider battle. The walls were scarred by musket fire, gates splintered under repeated assaults, and the surrounding woods were littered with broken equipment and fallen soldiers. Fires broke out inside parts of the building, creating suffocating heat and forcing defenders to relocate. Yet the garrison refused to abandon the position. Holding Hougoumont became a matter of pride and survival. The constant fighting drained French manpower, pulling in soldiers who otherwise might have strengthened the main attack elsewhere. Wellington later said that the Battle of Waterloo had turned on the closing of the gates at Hougoumont, and while that may have been an exaggeration, the significance of the position cannot be overstated. The defense absorbed thousands of French troops, kept Wellington's right anchored, and maintained a psychological advantage. Every minute the French failed to take the farm was another minute lost in a battle where timing would soon become the most decisive factor of all. As the battle surged across the field, a critical development was unfolding far to Napoleon's right. Reports began to arrive that Prussian forces were approaching sooner than expected. Napoleon had assumed Blücher would need more time to reorganize after the defeat at Ligny. Instead, Prussian units had marched through forests and muddy roads with remarkable speed and determination. At first, Napoleon dismissed the early reports as exaggeration, believing they were describing small detachments or scouts. But as the messages continued, it became clear that a significant Prussian force was indeed approaching the village of Plancenoit, dangerously close to the French rear. This meant Napoleon would soon be fighting on two fronts. His carefully crafted plan to defeat Wellington before the Prussians arrived was collapsing. Rather than shifting his entire strategy, Napoleon chose to send part of his reserve to delay the Prussians while the main army continued its effort to break the British center. This decision reflected his confidence, but also the limited options he had. He could not afford to stop attacking Wellington, because doing so would allow the British-led army to regain strength. At the same time, ignoring the Prussians would invite disaster. As Prussian troops drew nearer, the storm clouds over Napoleon's campaign darkened. The battle that began as a duel between two great commanders was turning into a race against time. After repeated attempts to break Wellington's line failed, Ney became convinced that the British were retreating. He saw scattered movements behind the ridge, not realizing they were routine repositioning rather than signs of collapse. Acting on this mistaken belief, Ney ordered a massive cavalry assault. It would become one of the largest cavalry charges of the era. Thousands of French horsemen began moving forward in waves, their armor gleaming and standards lifted high. Heavy cavalry, such as cuirassiers, led the charge, followed by lancers and dragoons. The ground was still muddy from the previous night's rain, slowing the horses and making their approach more exhausting than dramatic. Wellington's infantry reacted quickly. They formed squares, a defensive formation that cavalry struggled to penetrate. Bayonets pointed outward, ranks tight, and flags at the center. These squares could withstand even determined charges. As the French riders swept across the field, they found little room to maneuver between the squares. The British artillery had withdrawn to safer positions, denying the cavalry a chance to overrun the guns. Instead, the French horsemen circled, regrouped, and charged again. Their bravery was unquestioned, but the decision to attack infantry squares without strong infantry support was flawed. For over an hour, the cavalry surged up and down the ridge, losing horses and men to disciplined musket volleys. Ney's gamble became one of the most dramatic yet futile episodes of the battle. Inside the squares, British and Allied soldiers felt every moment of the cavalry's approach. They heard the thunder of hooves, the shouts of riders, and the clatter of sabers striking bayonets. The formations shook under the pressure, but the discipline of the troops kept them intact. Smoke from their own muskets drifted around the square, mixing with the dust kicked up by horses. In some places, cavalrymen rode so close that they could reach out with swords to strike at the front ranks. Yet the squares remained unbroken. Officers walked calmly through the formation, reminding soldiers to hold their fire until the riders were close enough for maximum effect. The psychological strain was intense. The men in the center of each square could not see the battle, only hear the chaos around them. The steady discipline required to maintain formation under such pressure was one of the reasons Wellington trusted his infantry so deeply. Even when parts of the line wavered, they reformed quickly. As charge after charge failed, the French cavalry became exhausted. Horses slipped in the mud, and riders struggled to reorganize for another push. The failure of the cavalry assaults drained French strength and gave Wellington renewed confidence that his line would hold until the Prussians arrived. The heavy cavalry attacks, though heroic, cost Napoleon dearly. Many of his finest riders and horses lay scattered across the ridge and valley. More important, the charges failed to achieve any meaningful strategic objective. The British line had not collapsed, and the cavalry had not captured artillery or broken squares. They had spent enormous energy for little gain. Napoleon watched the spectacle with frustration. He knew that every failed attack made his position worse, especially with the Prussians closing in. His original plan depended on breaking Wellington quickly, but now the afternoon was slipping away. The battlefield showed signs of strain on both sides. Units were depleted, ammunition ran low, and officers struggled to maintain order. Yet Wellington's army remained cohesive. Napoleon still held reserves, but he would soon be forced to choose between reinforcing Ney or turning more units to face the Prussians. The French emperor sensed the window for victory narrowing. Prussian scouting detachments had already begun exchanging fire with French troops near Plancenoit. If the Prussians broke through and linked with Wellington, the French army would be caught in a vice. What had once been an offensive campaign meant to restore Napoleon's power was becoming a desperate effort to avoid total defeat. Marshal Blücher had promised Wellington that the Prussian army would come, and he meant it. After the defeat at Ligny, many officers urged caution. The army had suffered losses, morale had dipped, and the terrain between them and Waterloo was difficult. Blücher rejected any suggestion of slowing down. He believed Napoleon had to be confronted decisively. His determination inspired his men, who respected his aggressive spirit even when his orders seemed ambitious. The march toward Waterloo was grueling. Roads had turned to mud, and many soldiers were exhausted, yet they pushed on with the understanding that their arrival could decide the fate of Europe. Officers rode along the lines, shouting encouragement and reminding troops of the importance of supporting Wellington. The sound of distant artillery guided their direction. By mid-afternoon, the leading Prussian units reached the eastern edge of the battlefield. They saw smoke hanging over the ridge and heard the intensity of fighting. The knowledge that they were arriving in time to influence the outcome lifted their spirits. Blücher ordered them to press forward toward Plancenoit, where they would strike the French flank and draw troops away from the main effort against Wellington. The march was one of the most impressive feats of endurance in the war, demonstrating not only bravery, but a commitment to coalition cooperation that Napoleon had always struggled to defeat. The village of Plancenoit soon became the center of a new and violent struggle. French troops sent to hold the area found themselves facing increasing numbers of Prussians who were determined to push through. Streets filled with smoke as soldiers fought house to house. The church and surrounding buildings became strong points, changing hands several times as both sides threw reinforcements into the fight. Napoleon realized that if the Prussians broke through Plancenoit, they would be in a position to roll up his entire right flank and cut off routes of retreat. He made the difficult decision to divert some of his Imperial Guard units to stabilize the village. These were elite soldiers, normally kept in reserve for decisive attacks. Committing them to defensive action showed how serious the situation had become. The Prussians fought with relentless determination. Many still carried anger from earlier defeats at Napoleon's hands, and the chance to strike at the French army directly energized them. The fighting in Plancenoit was chaotic and close. Musket fire echoed between buildings, and the narrow streets made movement difficult. Control of the village shifted repeatedly, with neither side able to secure a decisive advantage. The struggle for Plancenoit had become a battle within a battle, just as intense as the conflict at Hougoumont. The arrival of the Prussians placed enormous pressure on Napoleon's army. What had been a single-line battle was now a multi-directional conflict. French commanders struggled to communicate effectively across the shifting front. Some units did not know whether they were expected to attack, defend, or march to support another area. Morale remained strong among many soldiers, but fatigue and uncertainty were taking a toll. The thunder of Prussian guns on the right signaled to everyone that the French were no longer fighting only Wellington. Napoleon, once known for his ability to stay ahead of developing crises, was now forced into reactive decisions. He sent orders quickly, but delays and confusion slowed their execution. Wellington, meanwhile, felt renewed confidence as he learned that the Prussians had reached the field. The coordination was not perfect, but their arrival meant he no longer faced Napoleon alone. The French army since that time was slipping away. Although they still fought bravely, the larger strategic picture was turning against them. Afternoon shadows were beginning to stretch across the battlefield. The moment was approaching when Napoleon would have to make his final move, a decision that would either salvage the day or doom his empire for good. As the afternoon advanced toward its most critical moments, the French pressure on Haye, Sainte increased dramatically. The defenders, mostly German troops from the King's German Legion, had been holding out since late morning. Their rifles allowed them to slow the French advance, but they were running low on ammunition. The farmhouse, built of thick stone, gave them cover, yet every window and doorway had turned into a shooting position that required constant attention. Smoke from both French and Allied musket fire drifted across the yard, making it harder to see approaching threats. The courtyard filled with debris, broken beams, and wounded soldiers who could not be moved. French battalions reorganized again and again for renewed attacks, determined to take the position because they knew its fall would expose the heart of Wellington's line. Napoleon himself kept a close watch on this sector, aware that La Haye Sainte was becoming a pivot point in the struggle for control of the ridge. When the defenders finally sent word that they were almost out of ammunition, the situation reached a crisis. Fresh cartridges could not be delivered through the heavy fighting. The French sensed the change in tempo and launched a powerful new assault. After hours of determined resistance, the garrison was forced back, and the French surged into the farm. The tricolor was raised above the courtyard. For the first time all day, the French had taken a major strong point in the center, and thousands of soldiers nearby believed this might be the breakthrough they had been waiting for. Yet capturing La Haye Sainte came at a heavy cost and opened the door to both opportunity and danger as the wider battlefield continued to evolve. The loss of La Haye Sainte forced Wellington to make rapid adjustments. He had anticipated the possibility, but the timing was difficult. The French were already preparing to exploit the opening by pushing fresh infantry and artillery toward the gap. Wellington rode along the ridge, calmly giving orders, encouraging shaken units, and ensuring officers understood how to reposition their men. His leadership during this moment was essential, as many troops were exhausted and suffering from intense bombardment. Despite the pressure, he recognized that the French were also weakening. Their cavalry had overextended earlier, and their infantry around Hougoumont had been drained. The fall of La Haye Sainte was troubling, but not decisive by itself. Wellington shortened parts of his line, adding reserves to reinforce the center while keeping a watch on both flanks. The arrival of more Prussian units on the far left gave him greater flexibility. He was careful not to expose gaps that French commanders might exploit. The British-led army remained battered but cohesive. Soldiers dug in their heels and braced for what they knew would be the largest attack yet. Wellington's calm manner, even under the threat of a breakthrough, inspired confidence. Officers noted that he rarely raised his voice even in critical moments. His ability to read the ground and anticipate enemy movements helped stabilize the line at a time when lesser commanders might have faltered. With La Haye Sainte lost, the next French move would be decisive, and Wellington positioned his army to withstand it. The capture of La Haye Sainte presented Napoleon with a fleeting opportunity. For a moment, he believed he could still break Wellington's center before the Prussians gained full control of the eastern edge of the battlefield. Yet the situation was becoming more complex every minute. Reports from Plancenoit told him that the Prussians were pushing harder and that his reserves were nearly spent in trying to hold them back. Meanwhile, Ney was urging him to commit the Imperial Guard to exploit the opening near La Haye Sainte. The Imperial Guard had never been broken in major battle, and Napoleon typically saved them for decisive moments. Committing them too early risked losing his last reliable force. Waiting too long risked losing the battle entirely. This tension defined Napoleon's dilemma. He understood that the French center had gained momentum, but that the enemy on his flank was becoming more dangerous. Additional messages from the right confirmed that Blücher was personally leading more troops forward. Napoleon could no longer rely on delaying tactics. He had to choose between reinforcing Plancenoit or launching a final push against Wellington. His officers sensed his growing frustration, though they remained loyal and ready to carry out whatever orders he gave. Napoleon knew that the next decision would determine whether he regained glory or faced irreversible defeat. The battlefield was moving beyond his full control, and even his legendary tactical instincts were now being tested by the speed and scale of the unfolding crisis. As more Prussian troops poured into the field, Blücher coordinated a determined push to overwhelm the French at Plancenoit. The Prussians understood that their success here would free them to strike directly in Napoleon's main line or roll up the French from the flank. The terrain made movement difficult. Marshy ground, narrow paths, and battered buildings slowed their advance, but the Prussians moved with purpose. Blücher encouraged his men personally, riding close enough to hear musket fire crack past him. He reminded them that they were fighting not only for victory, but for the security of Europe. The French defenders, though brave, were stretched thin and weary. Their attempts to hold the village were becoming more desperate as more Prussian battalions arrived. Each time the French forced the Prussians back, the attackers reorganized and returned with renewed force. Smoke hung thickly above the village, and flames from burning buildings illuminated pieces of the battlefield. Blücher's growing advantage in numbers began to show. French commanders requested reinforcements that Napoleon no longer had to spare. The Prussian artillery advanced methodically, bringing guns into positions where they could fire down the lanes of the village. Their shells crashed into French positions with growing accuracy. Napoleon's right flank was under threat not only tactically but structurally. The French defenses at Plancenoit were beginning to crumble, and the Prussians sensed that a decisive breakthrough was within reach. Napoleon had committed elements of the Young Guard and Middle Guard to Plancenoit earlier, and now he was forced to send part of the Old Guard as well. These soldiers were among the best trained and most loyal in the entire French army. Their appearance on the battlefield often inspired those around them. They pushed into Plancenoit with discipline and force, driving back Prussian units that had come close to breaking through. For a brief time, the village returned to French control. Yet even these elite troops faced difficulties. The Prussians were bringing forward fresh battalions, some of which had marched for hours without rest, but were still eager to fight. As the Guard pushed forward, they found themselves hit by musket fire from newly arrived units. The narrow streets made it impossible to use their usual battlefield formations effectively. They relied on bayonet charges and determined close-quarters combat to hold ground. Though the Guard's arrival slowed the Prussian advance, it could not stop it entirely. Blücher continued sending waves of reinforcements, and the pressure increased by the minute. Napoleon's decision to deploy part of the Guard at Plancenoit meant he had fewer elite troops available for any final attack against Wellington. Each moment of delay made his situation more precarious. The Guard could fight fiercely, but they could not be everywhere at once, and the battlefield was becoming too large and chaotic for any single force to control. Although Wellington and Blücher were operating from different positions, the two commanders were indirectly coordinating through the movement of their armies. Wellington's left flank began to feel the presence of Prussian skirmishers who pushed forward from the direction of the woods and villages. Officers on the Allied side cheered as they saw Prussian banners appear in the distance. Their arrival boosted morale and reassured Wellington that he would not face Napoleon alone in the final phase of the battle. Wellington signaled that he would hold firm, giving the Prussians space to maneuver around the French flank. Blücher understood that his goal was not to capture territory, but to collapse the French position by striking where Napoleon was weakest. The growing pressure on Plancenoit forced Napoleon to divide his attention more than ever before. As the Prussian line expanded, it threatened to merge with Wellington's left, creating a combined front that the French army could not match in strength or coordination. Napoleon's operational advantage had vanished. What remained was a battle of endurance, command, and timing. Wellington prepared his infantry to withstand the final French push, knowing that if they held long enough, the Prussians would turn the tide. Blücher, Meanwhile, pressed harder, determined to crush the French flank and remove them from the field entirely. Their cooperation, even without direct communication at every moment, created a powerful force that Napoleon was no longer able to counter effectively. As late afternoon turned toward evening, Napoleon realized he had run out of time. The Prussians were closing in from the right, the French attacks against Wellington had stalled, and the battlefield was slowly slipping out of his control. His last reserve, the Imperial Guard, remained uncommitted in the center. These were the soldiers who had never failed him in battle, veterans known for their discipline and resolve. Napoleon gathered several battalions of the Middle and Old Guard and prepared them for a final assault on Wellington's line. He delivered a brief address, telling them that the fate of France depended on their courage. The Guard responded with a calm determination that reflected their experience. They began marching toward the ridge in tight columns, drums beating steadily, eagles held high. French soldiers across the field saw the movement and shouted with renewed hope. For years, the advance of the Imperial Guard had marked the turning point of many battles. Napoleon hoped that even now, with the odds against him, their charge might break the British center and give him the opportunity to defeat Wellington before the Prussians completed their encirclement. Yet the situation was far more dangerous than at any previous moment of his career. His men were exhausted, his cavalry depleted, his reserves nearly gone. The Guard represented not only his last hope, but his final gamble in a campaign defined by desperate timing and narrowing possibilities. As the Guard marched up the slope toward Wellington's line, they encountered some of the heaviest fire of the entire day. British artillery, which had been withdrawn earlier during the cavalry assaults, had now returned to well-chosen positions. The gunners waited until the Guard were close before unleashing devastating volleys. Cannonballs ripped through the advancing columns, sending gaps down the lines. Yet the Guard pressed on, maintaining formation even under severe losses. Their stoicism earned respect from enemy and ally alike. As they climbed the ridge, British infantry units waited behind the crest. At the right moment, they stood and delivered controlled volleys into the approaching Guard. The exchange of fire was brutal. The French attempted to deploy into line, but the slope and incoming volleys disrupted their effort. Officers shouted orders, trying to push forward despite the mounting casualties. The Guard fought with their usual discipline, but this time they faced an enemy who had prepared carefully for this moment. Unlike earlier French assaults, this advance lacked support from cavalry or fresh infantry. Napoleon had nothing left to commit. The Guard reached close range and tried to push through, but the Allied resistance held firm. Muskets cracked in rapid succession, and smoke turned the ridge into a haze of flickering movement. The Guard continued fighting, but for the first time in their storied history, their advance began to falter under the concentrated weight of disciplined musketry. As the Guard struggled to maintain momentum, a sudden shift occurred. British and Allied troops delivered close-range volleys that shattered the front ranks of the advancing French. The Guard tried to push forward again, but they could not realign their formations quickly enough. Witnesses reported that the command, La Garde Recule, echoed across parts of the battlefield, though whether it was spoken by French officers or shouted by enemies remains debated. What is certain is that the Guard began to fall back. Their retreat carried enormous symbolic weight. For many French soldiers watching from below, the sight of the Guard withdrawing broke their morale. Panic spread through exhausted battalions who had fought all day under the belief that the Guard would save them in the end. Wellington saw the moment and ordered a general advance. His infantry, who had been fighting defensively for hours, now surged forward with renewed determination. On the right and left, Prussian forces intensified their pressure, creating a collapse that spread rapidly through the French ranks. What had begun as a controlled withdrawal became a rout in several areas. Napoleon tried to rally his troops, but the battlefield was no longer under any commander's control. The retreat of the Imperial Guard marked the psychological and tactical breaking point. The French army, once feared across Europe, now faced total defeat as darkness began to fall over Waterloo. Once Wellington saw the Imperial Guard recoil, he seized the opportunity immediately. He had spent the entire day fighting defensively, preserving his strength while waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Now that moment had arrived. He rose in his saddle and waved his hat, signaling his infantry to advance. Across the ridge, weary but determined battalions began moving forward in coordinated lines. The once static British formations now surged ahead with a mixture of relief, fury, and disciplined resolve. For hours they had been absorbing French attacks, watching comrades fall beside them, enduring artillery bombardments, and resisting the massive cavalry charges. Now the tide had finally turned. The French troops who remained on the slope were already shaken by the retreat of the Guard. They had expected the elite units to break the British center, not fall back under heavy fire. As British infantry pressed down the ridge, they fired continuous volleys into the disorganized French ranks. Officers tried to rally their men, but many soldiers were physically and mentally spent. Some units fought bravely to delay the British advance, but others began to fall back faster than their commanders could control. The cohesion Napoleon had once relied upon was unraveling. The countryside that had been filled with smoke and confusion throughout the day now echoed with the sound of advancing Allied troops and shouting French officers desperate to restore order. Wellington's counterattack was not simply a push forward. It was the beginning of the collapse of the French center, and every step his infantry took tightened the pressure on Napoleon's already strained forces. As the French center began to crumble, Napoleon's marshals rushed to reorganize key units. They attempted to form defensive lines to protect the retreating troops and give the army time to regroup, but the battlefield no longer responded to command. Exhausted infantrymen stumbled backward, struggling to reload their muskets or find their formations. Cavalry units that had charged repeatedly earlier no longer had enough horses or strength to intervene meaningfully. Officers shouted conflicting orders, trying to gather remnants of battalions into coherent formations, but the noise of battle drowned out many commands. The retreat of the Imperial Guard had cracked the psychological foundation of the French army. Even though many soldiers were still capable fighters, their confidence had evaporated almost instantly. Rumors spread that the Prussians were closing in behind them, increasing the panic. The reality was equally grim. More Prussian units were pushing toward the center, making escape difficult. Small pockets of French soldiers attempted to make last stands, firing volleys and shouting defiance, but they were pushed back by advancing British and Prussian infantry. The once proud formations that had marched into Belgium with hopes of restoring Napoleon's power were now dissolving into scattered groups. Amid the chaos, French artillerymen tried to hold their ground, firing their guns until enemy infantry was nearly upon them. Some spiked their cannons to prevent capture, others abandoned them entirely. The battlefield was turning into a scene of confusion, exhaustion, and disorder. Napoleon's army, which had begun the day with confidence, was now fighting for survival as its structure collapsed before his eyes. Napoleon had always possessed an extraordinary ability to read the battlefield, but as he looked across the breaking lines at Waterloo, he understood with cold clarity that the battle, and with it his empire, was slipping beyond recovery. The vision of the Guard retreating had shaken him deeply. These were the men he counted on above all others, and their withdrawal meant that even his most elite troops could not save the day. He attempted to ride among the fleeing soldiers, urging them to stand and fight, but the men were too disoriented to respond effectively. Panic had spread too widely. Meanwhile, reports from Plancenoit grew worse. The Prussians had finally secured the village and were now pushing out toward the French rear. This meant that the French army was in danger of being trapped between Wellington's advancing forces and Blücher's relentless pressure from the flank. Napoleon understood the consequences immediately. If he stayed too long, large sections of his army could be surrounded and destroyed. If he retreated in good order, he might preserve enough troops to continue resistance in the days ahead, though the strategic situation was bleak. His face reportedly showed a rare moment of despair as he took in the scale of defeat. Yet he also recognized that lingering would only worsen the disaster. He needed to withdraw before total encirclement became unavoidable. For one of the greatest commanders in history, this was a moment he had hoped never to face again. Years earlier, he had experienced a similar collapse at Leipzig, but Waterloo carried far greater finality. Napoleon now knew the battle was lost, and with it the last chance to maintain his rule over France. The retreat had to begin. Even after the failed assault, the Imperial Guard maintained enough discipline to provide the army with one final service. Napoleon ordered them to form squares and act as a rear guard, protecting the retreating forces from total destruction. These exhausted but steadfast soldiers positioned themselves along key routes to slow the advance of the Allies. They faced not only British infantry pushing down the ridge, but also Prussian units striking from the flank. Despite overwhelming odds, the Guard fought with remarkable endurance. Their squares, though depleted, held their formation and fired coordinated volleys into approaching troops. The British were cautious about attacking them directly, knowing the Guard still possessed the capacity to inflict severe damage. For a time, the presence of the Guard slowed the Allied advance. They bought crucial minutes for thousands of French soldiers to retreat toward the road leading to France. Yet the pressure on them was immense. Some squares were surrounded and overwhelmed, while others fell back step by step, refusing to collapse even as casualties mounted. Their resistance became one of the most respected actions of the day, acknowledged even by their enemies. Although the Guard could not save the battle, they prevented its ending from becoming an even greater catastrophe. Their stand remained a symbol of loyalty, courage, and professionalism at a moment when much of the French army was dissolving around them. While Wellington allowed his troops a measured advance, the Prussians pressed forward with relentless energy. Blücher had vowed that there would be no rest until the French army was destroyed. He remembered the defeats his nation had suffered in earlier campaigns and saw Waterloo as the moment to finish the struggle once and for all. As evening shadows stretched across the battlefield, Prussian cavalry advanced rapidly along the roads and fields, pursuing fleeing French units. They cut down stragglers, captured artillery, and broke up retreating columns before they could reorganize. French officers tried to stave off panic, but the Prussian pursuit made orderly retreat increasingly difficult. Roads clogged with wagons, wounded men, and abandoned equipment. Horses struggled to move through the crowded routes, and darkness made coordination even harder. The Prussians did not give the French time to regroup. Their aggressive pursuit ensured that the defeat at Waterloo would not resemble earlier setbacks, where Napoleon had managed to rebuild a damaged army quickly. Blücher intended to deny him that chance. His cavalry pushed well into the night, leaving French soldiers exhausted and scattered across miles of countryside. By pressing so hard, the Prussians ensured that the retreat turned into a long and traumatic flight. Confidence in Napoleon's ability to reverse the situation evaporated with every passing moment. The Prussian pursuit ensured that the French defeat would be total, not partial. As the French retreated into the night, Wellington's army remained in control of the battlefield. The ridge that had served as his defensive anchor was now the center of Allied victory. Wellington rode across the field to assess the situation, though he later admitted he found the scene difficult to bear. The ground was covered with fallen soldiers from both sides. The fields near Hougoumont and Sainte were littered with broken equipment, shattered walls, and bodies lying among burned-out buildings. Many wounded cried out for aid, and medical personnel began the slow and painful process of helping survivors. The British-led forces, exhausted from the long day, secured their positions and prepared for pursuit in the days to come. Wellington understood the magnitude of what had been accomplished. He had faced one of history's greatest commanders and endured a series of fierce assaults before turning the tide with perfect timing. Yet victory came at a great cost. Thousands of Allied troops had fallen in the fighting, and many units were reduced to a fraction of their morning strength. Still, the strategic significance of the moment was clear. Napoleon's final gamble had failed, and Europe stood on the edge of a new era. Wellington held the field, but the emotional weight of the victory lingered in his mind long after the sounds of battle faded into the night. After leaving the battlefield, Napoleon attempted to regain control of his shattered army. He believed that if he could assemble enough remaining troops, he might still defend France against the advancing coalition armies. However, the forces retreating from Waterloo were in no condition to fight again soon. Many soldiers had discarded weapons during the flight. Units were scattered, horses lost, and supply wagons captured or abandoned. The cohesion that once defined Napoleon's armies had evaporated. Officers trying to reorganize battalions found that some companies had lost more than half their men. Rumors spread rapidly, some claiming that the Prussians were only hours behind them, others suggesting that French allies would abandon Napoleon entirely. Panic mixed with exhaustion, making it nearly impossible to restore order. Napoleon traveled ahead of many of his troops, hoping to reach Paris before news of the defeat caused widespread political turmoil. He understood that public confidence in his leadership depended on how he presented the situation. Yet even he could not ignore the scale of the disaster. Waterloo was not a temporary setback. It was the collapse of his final attempt to reclaim his empire. The retreat stretched for miles across villages and forest roads, leaving behind a disorganized force that could not mount a credible defense. By the time the remnants of the army approached Paris, it was clear that the military situation was beyond salvation. News of the defeat reached Paris before Napoleon himself. Political leaders, who had reluctantly supported his return during the 100 Days, now questioned whether he could continue to rule. France had endured years of warfare, and the promise of renewed conflict under Napoleon had always been a source of tension. Waterloo proved that the coalition could not be defeated and that resisting further would risk destruction of the nation. As Napoleon entered the capital, he tried to persuade officials that the army could still regroup and that new levies could be raised. But the Chamber of Deputies refused to support another campaign. They demanded that he step aside for the good of France. Napoleon considered dissolving the government and ruling by force, but without a functional army, such a move was impossible. Reluctantly, he abdicated for the second time, this time in favor of his son, though the coalition refused to recognize the claim. His political power had ended. The man who had once dominated Europe now found himself with no throne, no army, and no path back to leadership. His supporters urged him to flee to America, but coalition forces moved quickly to prevent his escape. The political fallout from Waterloo reshaped France overnight. The restored monarchy returned, and the era of Napoleonic dominance came to a definitive close. Realizing there was no chance to flee the continent, Napoleon surrendered to the British, believing they would treat him more fairly than other coalition powers. He boarded a British ship with the expectation that he might be allowed to live quietly in exile, perhaps in the United States. Instead, the British government decided that the only way to prevent his return was to send him to a distant location. They chose the remote island of St. Helena in the South Atlantic. The island was isolated, harsh, and far from any political or military influence. Napoleon accepted his fate with a mix of resignation and defiance. Though he had hoped for a more dignified retirement, he understood why the European powers feared him. His presence alone had been enough to inspire uprisings, loyalty, and military responses across the continent. He spent the remainder of his life on St. Helena, reflecting on his campaigns and dictating memoirs that shaped his legacy for generations. Waterloo thus became more than a military defeat. It marked the end of the Revolutionary and Napoleonic eras, closing a chapter of European history defined by sweeping political change, massive armies, and shifting alliances. Monarchies were restored, borders redrawn, and a new balance of power established. Napoleon's influence continued through legal reforms and national identities he helped shape, but his ability to determine the fate of nations ended the moment the fields of Waterloo fell silent. The world had entered a different age. When the news of Napoleon's defeat at Waterloo reached the major capitals of Europe, it spread with a mixture of shock, relief, and triumph. For nearly 2 decades, the continent had lived under the constant pressure of French expansion and the unpredictability of Napoleonic warfare. Kings, ministers, diplomats, and ordinary citizens alike had endured the rise and fall of empires, shifting borders, and economic turmoil. Waterloo brought an abrupt end to the fear that Napoleon might dominate Europe again. In London, celebrations broke out even before the full casualty lists were known. Newspapers published dramatic accounts of Wellington's victory. Church bells rang, and crowds gathered in public squares, hoping to hear first-hand stories from returning officers. The mood was different in Vienna, where diplomats at the Congress had been negotiating a post-war settlement. They knew Napoleon's return from Elba had upended their delicate arrangements. His defeat allowed them to continue rebuilding Europe with renewed confidence. In Berlin, the Prussian people viewed Waterloo as revenge for earlier humiliations, especially the disastrous defeat at Jena years before. Families who had lost sons in the wars felt that their sacrifices had finally produced lasting security. Even in Russia, where Napoleon's invasion had caused immense suffering, the Tsar saw the victory as justification for maintaining a role in shaping Europe's future. Yet there was also caution beneath the celebration. European leaders understood that France, despite defeat, remained a powerful nation. The challenge now was to reintegrate it into the European system without provoking the kind of resentment or instability that had led to revolution and empire. Waterloo ended one chapter, but began another equally complex one as Europe tried to redefine itself after decades of turbulence. With Napoleon defeated, European leaders faced the challenge of preventing future disruptions on the same scale. The central idea guiding them was the concept of a balance of power. They believed that no single nation should grow so strong that it could threaten the entire continent, as France had done under Napoleon. The Congress of Vienna, already in progress before Waterloo, gained renewed urgency. Diplomats from Austria, Britain, Russia, Prussia, and smaller states debated borders, alliances, and spheres of influence. Their goal was to create a structure that would stabilize Europe and discourage aggression. Britain sought to limit French influence without crippling the country, believing France should remain strong enough to act as a counterbalance to more authoritarian powers like Russia. Austria focused on maintaining control over its diverse territories, fearing nationalist movements that had gained momentum during the Revolutionary era. Prussia aimed to expand its territory and strengthen its presence in Central Europe, hoping to secure its future as a major military power. Russia, confident after its role in defeating Napoleon, pushed for influence in Eastern Europe. These debates were intense, but Napoleon's defeat removed the immediate sense of crisis. The diplomats could work with greater freedom, knowing the war was truly over. Waterloo thus shaped not only military history, but diplomatic history as well, setting in motion agreements that would influence European politics for nearly a century. The emerging system encouraged negotiation over confrontation, and while it did not prevent all conflicts, it helped maintain relative peace for decades. The balance of power became an enduring concept because of the lessons nations learned from the age of revolution and empire. Inside France, the reaction to Waterloo was more complex. The defeat was undeniable, yet the nation remained deeply divided about how to move forward. Some citizens blamed Napoleon for dragging France into yet another disastrous war that could have been avoided. Others still admired him and believed he had been betrayed by circumstances, foreign enemies, or political rivals. The return of King Louis XVIII generated mixed feelings. Many feared a complete restoration of old aristocratic privileges, while others hoped the monarchy would bring stability after decades of upheaval. The French economy was strained, and the army was demoralized. Veterans struggled with the emotional and physical scars of years of constant conflict. Farmers and merchants faced the challenge of rebuilding livelihoods disrupted by mobilization and invasion. At the same time, France had undergone profound changes during the Revolutionary and Napoleonic eras. Legal reforms, merit-based careers, and secular government structures had reshaped society in lasting ways. Even after the monarchy returned, these reforms were difficult to reverse. The challenge for France was not simply recovering from military defeat, but redefining its identity after years of dramatic transformation. The people had experienced monarchy, revolution, dictatorship, and empire in rapid succession. They needed stability, but they also wanted to preserve many of the reforms that had modernized their nation. The years after Waterloo became a period of political tension, cultural reassessment, and gradual rebuilding. France would eventually regain its footing, but the shadow of Napoleon and the memory of his final defeat remained deeply embedded in the nation's consciousness. Waterloo quickly became one of the most studied battles in military history. Commanders, historians, and theorists from many nations sought to understand why Napoleon failed and why Wellington and Blücher succeeded. The battle demonstrated the importance of timing, coordination, and terrain. Wellington's use of the ridge and strong points showed how defensive positions could neutralize superior attacking forces. His measured distribution of troops, combined with the ability to move reserves quickly, allowed him to endure repeated assaults. On the other hand, Napoleon's decisions reflected both brilliance and limitations. His early strategy aimed to divide the British and Prussian armies, a plan that had succeeded in past campaigns. But delays, weather, and unexpected Prussian resilience disrupted his timing. The battle also highlighted the dangers of underestimating coalition coordination. Napoleon assumed the Prussians would take longer to arrive. When they appeared earlier than expected, his strategic assumptions collapsed. The failure of Ney's massive cavalry charges illustrated how tactics from earlier battles could become ineffective under changing conditions. Infantry squares proved too strong for unsupported cavalry, especially when terrain slowed the charge. Artillery, often decisive in Napoleonic warfare, underperformed due to wet ground and defensive positioning. Military academies across Europe used Waterloo as a case study for how battlefield dynamics could override even the most experienced commander's intentions. Strategy had to adapt not only to the enemy, but to conditions, geography, morale, and political context. Waterloo became a lasting reminder that no victory is guaranteed, even for the most accomplished leaders. One of the most enduring images of Waterloo is the final stand of the Imperial Guard. Stories spread that when asked to surrender, the Guard replied with famous defiance. Some versions claim an officer shouted that the Guard dies, but does not surrender. Whether or not such exact words were spoken, the spirit of the Guard's resistance became legendary. Their disciplined retreat and their willingness to hold off overwhelming enemy forces allowed thousands of French soldiers to escape. Military observers admired their professionalism, noting how they maintained formation even when surrounded. At the same time, historians caution against romanticizing the moment too heavily. The Guard were elite soldiers, but their defeat did not occur in isolation. They were committed too late, lacked the necessary support, and faced an enemy whose morale surged at the critical moment. Their collapse was as much a consequence of strategic failure as battlefield heroism. Even so, their stand became a symbol of loyalty and courage in a losing cause. Artists, writers, and later filmmakers depicted the scene with dramatic intensity, emphasizing the contrast between their discipline and the surrounding chaos. The myth of the Guard continued to shape military culture long after the Napoleonic era ended. Officers in various armies studied their conduct as an example of how elite units should behave under pressure. Their final stand at Waterloo became more than a military event. It became a cultural memory, representing honor, resilience, and the tragic grandeur of a fallen empire. Waterloo marked the end of one kind of warfare and the beginning of another. The Napoleonic era had been defined by large-scale field battles, rapid movement, and decisive engagements. Napoleon's campaigns had revolutionized military organization, emphasizing mass conscription, corps systems, and flexible maneuvering. Waterloo showed both the strength and limits of these innovations. After the battle, European powers increasingly emphasized industrialization, logistics, and long-term planning. The age of aristocratic officers commanding small professional armies had already ended with the French Revolution. Now another transition was underway as armies grew larger and more dependent on national resources. Waterloo influenced how nations prepared for war in the decades that followed. It became clear that alliances could defeat even the strongest military genius if coordination and determination aligned. European states strengthened diplomatic ties and built systems to prevent the rise of another dominant power. Warfare would soon evolve again with railroads, improved firearms, and mass industrial production. But Waterloo remained the symbolic boundary between the old world and the modern one. It represented not only a military victory, but a shift in how nations understood power, strategy, and cooperation. The battle's legacy reached far beyond the fields of Belgium. It helped define the military and political landscape of the 19th century and influenced decisions that shaped the world for generations. Waterloo became a powerful symbol in literature almost immediately after the battle. Writers across Europe used it as a backdrop for stories about courage, fate, tragedy, and the rise and fall of great men. Poets described the battlefield's emotional intensity, while novelists portrayed the human experiences hidden behind the official reports. Victor Hugo's famous novel Les Miserables contains one of the most detailed literary depictions of Waterloo, exploring not only the tactics but the moral weight of the event. British authors often celebrated the heroism of Wellington and the endurance of Allied troops. French writers, meanwhile, struggled between mourning the defeat and honoring the bravery of French soldiers. Over time, Waterloo became a metaphor for final defeat, a moment when ambition meets immovable reality. The phrase "to meet one's Waterloo" entered everyday language, symbolizing a decisive downfall. Artists painted dramatic scenes of the battle, emphasizing the contrast between chaos and heroism. Music and theater also embraced the theme, turning Waterloo into a cultural reference point far beyond military history. Its emotional resonance came not only from the scale of the conflict, but from the sense that an entire era ended in a single day. Literature helped transform Waterloo into more than a historical event. It became a story retold across generations, shaped by artistic interpretation and national memory. Different nations remembered Waterloo in distinct ways. In Britain, the victory became a cornerstone of national pride. Wellington was celebrated as a symbol of steadiness, discipline, and leadership. Monuments were built, regiments honored, and the battle entered national school curricula. The British narrative emphasized the idea of standing firm against overwhelming odds. In Prussia, Waterloo was viewed not as Wellington's triumph, but as the culmination of Prussian resilience. Many Germans believed their intervention had been decisive, and Blücher became a national hero. The battle fit into a broader story of German unity and strength that grew throughout the 19th century. In France, the memory of Waterloo was more complicated. It represented both defeat and dignity. The French celebrated the courage of their soldiers, even as they mourned the collapse of Napoleon's final campaign. The Imperial Guard's resistance became the focus of French memory, overshadowing the strategic failures that led to defeat. Across Europe, each nation shaped the narrative to reflect its values and identity. Waterloo thus became not a single shared memory, but a collection of competing interpretations. These narratives influenced international relations, political rhetoric, and cultural identity for decades. Even today, the way the battle is remembered reveals how nations choose to understand their past. In the years after the battle, Waterloo became one of the first major sites of historical tourism. Veterans, families, and curious travelers visited the ridge, the farms, and the monuments erected to commemorate the event. Local residents preserved many of the structures, such as Hougoumont and Sainte, allowing visitors to see the places where crucial moments had unfolded. As decades passed, historians and governments worked to protect the battlefield from development. Paths were marked, museums created, and memorials installed to honor the fallen. The site attracted scholars, reenactors, and tourists who wanted to understand the scale and significance of the conflict. Guides offered detailed accounts, walking visitors through the movements of troops and the decisions of commanders. The battlefield became not only a place of remembrance, but a living classroom for military history. Efforts to maintain the landscape faced challenges as modern life encroached, yet the desire to preserve the site remained strong. Waterloo's preservation symbolized a broader recognition that history must be kept alive through physical spaces. Standing on the ridge or near the walls of Hougoumont allowed people to connect with the past in a direct and powerful way. The battlefield became part of global memory, attracting visitors from around the world who sought to understand how one day reshaped the destiny of nations. The Battle of Waterloo left behind one of the most painful human landscapes of the 19th century. Soldiers who had marched into Belgium with confidence and pride now found themselves facing the raw consequences of modern warfare. In the hours after the fighting, thousands lay wounded across the fields, calling for help in multiple languages. The orchard of Hougoumont, the sunken lane near the ridge, and the muddy fields in front of La Haye Sainte were filled with men who could not move. Many had broken limbs, deep bayonet wounds, or severe musket injuries. Others suffered from shattered bones caused by cannonballs that bounced unpredictably across the wet ground. Field hospitals were overwhelmed almost immediately. Surgeons worked through the night with limited supplies, using whatever tools they had. Amputations were performed without anesthesia, and the sounds of pain echoed through barns and farmhouses converted into emergency stations. Water was scarce, clean bandages even scarcer. Many wounded waited hours before being seen, and some died before help arrived. Yet amid the horror, acts of compassion occurred. Soldiers gave water to the wounded regardless of uniform. Officers checked on both friend and foe. Locals risked their safety to bring food and blankets, even as the smell of gunpowder still hung thick in the air. The human cost of Waterloo was not measured only in numbers, but in the physical and emotional trauma carried by survivors. Many soldiers would return home with lifelong disabilities, while others carried memories of the battlefield that stayed with them long after their wounds healed. The villages and farms surrounding Waterloo became unwilling participants in one of Europe's most decisive battles. Civilians who had spent years living under shifting occupation now faced the fear of a battle fought at their doorstep. Families hid in cellars while cannons roared above their homes. Children covered their ears as musket fire rattled through the walls. The fields that produced crops for local markets were torn apart by marching armies, cavalry charges, artillery fire, and retreating soldiers. When the fighting ended, residents emerged into a world transformed. Fences and orchards were destroyed, roofs smashed, windows shattered, and barns burned. Many found dead soldiers in their gardens or livestock fields. The emotional shock was immense. Some tried to help wounded men, while others searched for lost family members who had fled during the battle. The local economy faced immediate strain as supplies were requisitioned by both armies, leaving villagers with little to survive the coming weeks. Even after the armies moved on, disease spread quickly due to decomposing bodies and contaminated water sources. Civilians worked with visiting engineers and burial parties to clean the fields, often without payment and with minimal support. Their resilience became a hidden but essential part of recovering from the battle's devastation. Waterloo's impact on civilian life showed that war's consequences extended far beyond the soldiers who fought. The cost to ordinary families and local communities was enormous, shaping how the region remembered and preserved its painful history. For many soldiers and their families, the aftermath of Waterloo lasted far longer than the fighting itself. Veterans returned to their homes, changed in ways that were difficult to describe. Some carried physical scars that limited their ability to work, placing financial strain on households already struggling to rebuild. Others experienced emotional trauma from witnessing the violence, the cries of wounded friends, and the chaos of retreat or pursuit. The concept of long-term psychological injury was not well understood at the time, and many veterans suffered in silence. Families who received news of fallen loved ones faced a different kind of burden. Letters from commanders often provided only brief explanations, and identifying bodies on the battlefield was nearly impossible due to the scale of the carnage. Some never learned exactly where their sons or husbands fell. Governments offered pensions in some cases, but payments were often inconsistent or insufficient. In France, grief was compounded by political uncertainty. Families who had supported Napoleon now felt their sacrifices had been in vain. In Britain and Prussia, pride in victory mixed with sorrow for the men lost. Communities held ceremonies and created memorials to honor their fallen, but the personal losses remain deeply felt. Waterloo shaped not only national destinies, but individual lives across Europe. The survivors carried the memory of the battle into old age, telling stories to their children and grandchildren that blended pain, pride, and reflection. The human cost became an integral part of Waterloo's legacy, reminding future generations that behind every historical triumph or defeat are countless personal sacrifices that history books can never fully capture. Waterloo accelerated the restoration of monarchies throughout Europe. The victory allowed conservative leaders to argue that stability required traditional forms of government. While the French Revolution had introduced ideas of citizenship, equality, and popular sovereignty, many rulers believed these changes had unleashed too much turbulence. Napoleon's rise and fall seemed to confirm their fears. After his defeat, Louis XVIII returned to Paris under the protection of Allied forces. Other monarchies reinforced their power, tightening control over political expression. Yet the story was not one of simple reversal. Revolutionary principles had spread too widely to be erased. Legal reforms, administrative efficiency, and merit-based careers introduced during Napoleon's rule continued to influence governance in multiple countries. Even the restored French monarchy adopted parts of the Napoleonic Code, recognizing that the public valued many of the changes brought during the previous decades. The balance between old and new-shaped political debates long after Waterloo. Conservative leaders wanted order, while reformers pushed for greater representation and civil liberties. The battle did not end the struggle between monarchy and revolution, but created a framework for managing it. The European powers believed that peace required cooperation and restraint, not unchecked ambition. Waterloo thus became a symbol of the limits of revolutionary expansion while also preserving elements of a modern state that Napoleon helped develop. Waterloo accelerated the restoration of monarchies throughout Europe. The victory allowed conservative leaders to argue that stability required traditional forms of government. While the French Revolution had introduced ideas of citizenship, equality, and popular sovereignty, many rulers believed these changes had unleashed too much turbulence. Napoleon's rise and fall seemed to confirm their fears. After his defeat, Louis XVIII returned to Paris under the protection of Allied forces. Other monarchies reinforced their power, tightening control over political expression. Yet the story was not one of simple reversal. Revolutionary principles had spread too widely to be erased. Legal reforms, administrative efficiency, and merit-based careers introduced during Napoleon's rule continued to influence governance in multiple countries. Even the restored French monarchy adopted parts of the Napoleonic Code, recognizing that the public valued many of the changes brought during the previous decades. The balance between old and new-shaped political debates long after Waterloo. Conservative leaders wanted order, while reformers pushed for greater representation and civil liberties. The battle did not end the struggle between monarchy and revolution, but created a framework for managing it. The European powers believed that peace required cooperation and restraint, not unchecked ambition. Waterloo thus became a symbol of the limits of revolutionary expansion while also preserving elements of a modern state that Napoleon helped develop. After Waterloo, diplomacy entered a new phase marked by cooperation among the major powers. The concert of Europe emerged as a system where nations would meet periodically to resolve disputes and maintain stability. Britain, Austria, Russia, and Prussia took leading roles, believing that coordinated action was necessary to prevent another dominant power from rising. The idea was that dialogue and negotiation could prevent conflicts before they escalated into full wars. The coalition partners learned from the experience of fighting Napoleon, whose ambition had forced them to unite despite competing interests. They now aimed to preserve peace through communication rather than battlefield alliances. The formation of the Concert of Europe represented an early attempt at collective security. While not perfect, it helped reduce major conflicts for decades and influenced the diplomatic landscape of the 19th century. Smaller states gained a voice in broader European matters, though often limited by the priorities of the great powers. The system encouraged stability, but also created tension between national self-determination and the desire to maintain order. Waterloo's lesson, that unchecked power could destabilize an entire continent, guided these efforts. Diplomacy became as important as military strength, and the ability to negotiate effectively became a key measure of national influence. The Concert of Europe showed that the aftermath of Waterloo reached far beyond Belgium's fields, shaping the political architecture of the post-Napoleonic world. Waterloo elevated Britain's position in world affairs in a way no previous battle had. The victory reinforced the country's reputation for military reliability and strategic competence. Wellington became a national icon, but the broader significance of the battle lay in its timing. Britain had already been expanding its global presence through trade, naval power, and colonial influence. Waterloo confirmed that it could also shape continental politics. With Napoleon defeated, Britain no longer faced a rival capable of challenging its maritime dominance. The Royal Navy controlled critical sea routes, and economic expansion accelerated. Politically, the British government gained greater authority in European negotiations. Its financial contributions to coalition armies during the war had given it leverage, and Waterloo strengthened that position. Britain began to play a central role in shaping the balance of power, acting as a mediator, financier, and stabilizer. The Industrial Revolution further boosted its influence, allowing rapid growth in manufacturing and trade. Waterloo did not create Britain's empire, but it allowed the nation to pursue global interests without fear of European interference. The battle thus marked a turning point not only for continental politics, but for world history. Britain entered the 19th century as the leading global power, a role it would maintain until the rise of new competitors later in the century. The long-term political impact of Waterloo was therefore not confined to Europe. It influenced colonial expansion, economic development, and international relations in distant regions, making the battle a genuine turning point in global affairs. Modern historians continue to debate Napoleon's choices at Waterloo, analyzing how a commander celebrated for tactical brilliance could lose so decisively. Some argue that his strategic plan was sound, but undone by a series of unpredictable events, including weather, communication failures, and unexpected Prussian determination. Others point out that Napoleon, older and suffering from health problems, lacked the sharpness that defined his earlier campaigns. They note that he underestimated Wellington, assuming the British-led army was fragile and prone to panic. He was also overly confident that the Prussians would not recover quickly from their defeat at Ligny. Historians highlight that Napoleon's decision to delay the attack due to muddy ground allowed the Prussians more time to close in. His reliance on massive cavalry charges without sufficient infantry support revealed a misreading of battlefield conditions. The commitment of the Imperial Guard came too late and lacked coordination. Yet scholars also acknowledge that Napoleon faced enormous challenges. His army included many inexperienced recruits. Several of his marshals were not performing at their peak. The terrain favored the defenders, and the coalition forces were unusually well coordinated. Historians studying Waterloo today see it not as a simple failure, but as a convergence of factors that overwhelmed even a brilliant commander. The battle remains a reminder that historical outcomes depend on a combination of skill, timing, luck, and resilience. Waterloo is still taught in military academies because it offers lessons that remain relevant. Officers study the battle not only to understand tactics, but to explore leadership, decision-making, and the consequences of miscommunication. The importance of reliable intelligence is one key lesson. Napoleon underestimated the speed of the Prussian recovery, while Wellington and Blücher coordinated more effectively than expected. The battle also highlights the value of terrain. Wellington's use of the ridge provided natural protection that reduced French artillery effectiveness. Another lesson comes from Ney's cavalry charges, which demonstrated how failing to adapt tactics to conditions can lead to disaster. Waterloo is also used to illustrate the role of morale. The retreat of the Imperial Guard did more than open a gap. It signaled psychological collapse across the French army. Modern military leaders examine how Wellington maintained discipline under pressure and how Napoleon's earlier reputation influenced his soldiers' expectations. Waterloo shows how timing shapes outcomes. A delay of a few hours changed the fate of Europe. These lessons continue to influence officers preparing for roles in modern armies. By studying Waterloo, they understand how leadership decisions made under extreme stress can shape history. The battle remains a foundational case study because it connects strategic planning with human behavior, technology, environment, and coalition cooperation. Waterloo continues to capture public imagination 2 centuries after the battle because it sits at the crossroads of myth, drama, and historical transformation. People are drawn to stories of great leaders facing final tests. Napoleon's fall carries a sense of tragic inevitability, while Wellington's victory symbolizes resilience and steady leadership. Reenactments are held regularly on the battlefield, drawing thousands of participants who recreate the formations, uniforms, and movements of the armies. Museums and documentaries explore the personal stories of soldiers, showing how their lives intersected with the grand sweep of history. The public fascination also comes from the idea that one day of combat shaped the destiny of Europe. Visitors walk the ridge where Wellington stood or explore the woods near Hougoumont and imagine the fear and courage of those who fought there. Waterloo lives in film, art, novels, and political speeches, often used as a symbol for decisive moments when plans collapse or ambitions reach their limit. The battle's legacy remains alive because it reflects universal themes: leadership, fate, courage, miscalculation, and the cost of war. People see in Waterloo not just a historical event, but a mirror of human nature. Its continued presence in popular culture shows that some moments endure not only for their strategic significance, but for the stories they inspire across generations. Waterloo shaped the trajectory of independence movements and political revolutions around the world in ways that were not immediately visible in 1815, but became clear in the decades that followed. The defeat of Napoleon convinced many European governments that strong centralized control was necessary to prevent instability. This reaction slowed the pace of reform in monarchies across the continent. Yet beneath the surface, the ideals introduced during the French Revolution and spread during the Napoleonic era continued to inspire people far beyond France. The concept of citizenship, individual rights, and national identity resonated deeply in societies struggling against imperial control or internal oppression. In Latin America, revolutionary leaders like Simón Bolívar and José de San Martín watched events in Europe closely. Napoleon's fall did not weaken their determination. If anything, It showed that old empires could be challenged successfully and that change was possible even when faced with overwhelming odds. The same era saw rising national movements in Italy, Germany, and Eastern Europe. Though conservative governments attempted to suppress these ideas, they could not erase the desire for self-rule and unity. The restoration of monarchies after Waterloo only delayed these transformations. It did not prevent them. By the mid-19th century, revolutions swept across Europe in 1848, demonstrating that the ideological seeds planted during the Napoleonic period had taken firm root. Waterloo acted as a historical milestone, marking the end of one revolutionary wave, but indirectly setting the stage for the next. It shaped the global landscape by proving that ideas cannot be defeated simply by defeating armies. Political aspirations, once awakened, continue evolving until they find expression. The relative peace that followed Waterloo created the environment that allowed the Industrial Revolution to expand rapidly across Europe. Although the transformation had begun before the battle, the absence of large-scale continental warfare after 1815 enabled nations to redirect resources toward technological innovation, infrastructure, and economic development. Britain, already ahead in industrial growth, accelerated its progress, building factories, railways, and steam-powered ships that reshaped global trade. Investors no longer feared that war would disrupt commerce on the same scale as before. Instead, they poured money into new industries and transportation networks. Continental Europe, recovering from years of conflict, soon followed. Belgium, ironically the site of Waterloo, became one of the first industrialized nations on the continent. France modernized its manufacturing and transportation systems under a more stable government. Prussia used the decades after the battle to build railroads and industrial centers that later supported its military rise. The Industrial Revolution transformed societies, created new urban centers, and produced economic systems that were vastly more interconnected than anything Europe had known before. Waterloo contributed indirectly by ending the cycle of constant war that had burdened nations with debt and instability. Peace allowed long-term planning, the growth of global markets, and scientific innovation. The world that emerged in the 19th century, with factories, mass production, and modern financial systems, was shaped in part by the stability that followed Napoleon's final defeat. Waterloo closed one era and opened the door to another defined not by imperial conquest, but by industrial transformation. Waterloo reshaped the global order by influencing which nations gained influence and which ones faded from dominance. France, though still culturally and politically significant, no longer held the central position it had enjoyed during Napoleon's height. Its defeat allowed Britain and Russia to expand their reach. Britain, protected by naval strength and buoyed by economic growth, extended its colonial influence in Asia and Africa. The country's victory at Waterloo gave it prestige that supported diplomatic and commercial expansion. Russia increased its presence in Eastern Europe and the Near East, pushing its borders deeper into regions once controlled by the Ottoman Empire. The Prussian state, still developing in 1815, used the next decades to build economic and military power that eventually united Germany under its leadership. The United States, though geographically distant from Waterloo, benefited from European distraction and grew steadily in influence, securing its place as a future world power. Spain and Portugal, weakened by Napoleonic invasions, lost much of their overseas empires as independence movements succeeded. The defeat of Napoleon thus accelerated the decline of old empires while clearing space for emerging powers. These shifts were not immediate, but unfolded gradually across the 19th century. Waterloo marked the symbolic endpoint of the old imperial order rooted in dynasty and traditional monarchy, and helped pave the way for a world shaped by industrial energy, national identity, and global ambition. The reshaping of empires after Waterloo set the stage for future conflicts and collaborations, influencing the direction of world politics for generations. Waterloo remains important today because it represents a moment when the forces of ambition, resistance, cooperation, and historical change collided in a single dramatic event. Modern societies continue to study the battle not merely for its military elements, but for what it symbolizes: the limits of power, the unpredictability of human decisions, and the way a single day can shape the future of nations. Napoleon's defeat reminds leaders that even immense talent cannot compensate for misjudgment, exhaustion, or the coordinated will of opponents. Wellington's victory shows how discipline, patience, and understanding terrain can overcome repeated assaults. Blücher's arrival demonstrates the importance of alliances and the impact one determined commander can have on history. Waterloo also resonates because it sits at the transition between eras. It marks the close of the Revolutionary Age and the beginning of a century shaped by industrialization, nationalism, and global empires. In classrooms, the battle is used to illustrate how political, military, and social forces converge. In public culture, it remains a metaphor for decisive moments when someone or something meets an undeniable setback. People return to Waterloo not simply out of fascination with Napoleon, but because the event reflects universal truths about leadership, courage, and consequence. The story continues to matter because it reminds us that history turns on choices, alliances, and unpredictable human actions. Waterloo offers insights that extend far beyond the battlefield. Leaders in politics, business, and the military often turn to the battle for lessons about strategic planning, communication, and resilience. Napoleon's experience shows how dangerous it is to rely on assumptions rather than verified information. His belief that Blücher's Prussians were too damaged to return quickly created a false sense of security. In contrast, Wellington's methodical approach shows the value of preparation, calm decision-making, and understanding the limits of one's own forces. He positioned his troops to absorb pressure rather than break under it. Blücher's determination to support his ally highlights how commitment and trust can change the outcome of crisis. Waterloo also demonstrates the importance of timing. A delay of a few hours altered the strategic landscape entirely. In modern decision-making contexts, this translates to the awareness that opportunity and failure often hinge on swift yet thoughtful action. The battle illustrates the value of cooperation across different groups, the need to adapt rapidly when circumstances change, and the danger of overconfidence. Leaders studying Waterloo see how success depends not only on strength, but on judgment, flexibility, and understanding human behavior. These lessons continue to resonate because they apply in fields ranging from international relations to organizational management. Waterloo's most enduring meaning lies in how it symbolizes the end of one world and the beginning of another. The battle closed a chapter on the Revolutionary and Napoleonic eras, while opening the 19th century's era of industrial growth and shifting empires. It represents the moment when a towering figure met a final test and lost, reminding people that no power is permanent. Waterloo also symbolizes transformation. It forced European nations to rethink diplomacy, rebuild political systems, and reconsider how societies should be governed. Even today, the term Waterloo evokes a sense of irreversible turning points. It captures the idea that every ambition, no matter how great, may eventually confront a challenge it cannot overcome. At the same time, Waterloo highlights how collaboration and determination can reshape history. Wellington and Blücher succeeded because their forces held together under pressure and because they trusted each other's intentions. The victory created stability that allowed the modern world to develop. As a symbol, Waterloo carries emotional depth. It is both tragic and inspiring, representing loss and renewal. The battlefield itself, preserved as a place of memory, stands as a reminder of the lives sacrificed and the consequences of leadership. Waterloo endures because it captures the complexity of human history, the rise and fall of empires, the bravery of ordinary people, and the unpredictable turns that define our shared past. Its story continues to resonate, offering reflection, warning, and understanding for future generations. You've just traveled through the full story of Waterloo, a day when ambition collided with reality and the course of history changed forever. You heard how Napoleon's final gamble unraveled under pressure from Wellington's discipline and Blücher's determination. You followed the courage of soldiers on both sides, the collapse of the French line, the rise of a new balance of power in Europe, and the beginning of the modern age. The moral of Waterloo's story is clear. Even the greatest leaders face limits, and even the strongest armies can fall when timing, judgment, and cooperation break down. At the same time, unity, patience, and resilience can turn desperate situations into victory. Waterloo teaches us about human ambition, the cost of war, and the unpredictable turning points that shape our world. If you enjoyed this journey and want more stories that explore the hidden depth behind major events, make sure to return to History Teller YT. There are many more battles, empires, mysteries, and forgotten moments waiting for you. Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and let history speak.